How do 4 million people wake up one morning and forget they're Roman? Well, it probably starts when someone rips up their beautiful Roman mosaic floor and installs a big, ugly corn dryer. But why would anyone do that? How do you lose 400 years of a way of life in a single generation when the people who lived it are still right there? Hi, I'm Harriet, and welcome back to the channel. To answer that, we need to start with the money. If you want to understand how Roman Britain starts to unravel, money is one of the best places to look for clues. Because if new Roman coins stop arriving in your world, something bigger has already gone wrong. But before we follow the coins, there's an obvious question you're probably asking. Why did the Romans leave Britain in the first place? And it's a good question. And here's the very potted version. By the early 5th century AD, Rome was under pressure across the Western Empire. Armies were being pulled between crises. Rival emperors were fighting for control. Taxes, troops, and supplies were harder to keep moving. And Britain sat at the far edge of that system, across the Channel, expensive to defend and increasingly difficult to govern from the centre. And when that imperial machine starts failing, coins are one of the first places you can see it. In 1992, a retired gardener named Eric Laws was out in a field in Suffolk with a metal detector, looking for a hammer that his friend had lost. He eventually did find the hammer, you'll be glad to know, but before that, he found more than 15,000 Roman coins, along with gold jewellery and silver tableware, all buried deliberately in a wooden chest. It became known as the Hoxne Hoard. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a lovely story about buried treasure, and to be fair, it is. Most stories improve noticeably when someone digs up 15,000 coins in Suffolk, but Hoxne also points to something going badly wrong. After about 402, the supply of new Roman coinage to Britain appears to have dried up almost completely. That's 8 years before the traditional date for the end of Roman rule in Britain. So the monetary system was already seizing up before the withdrawal was even finished. Richard Rees, who spent decades studying Roman coin finds in Britain, argued that by the early 5th century, Britain had effectively abandoned the use of coinage. But not overnight, because old coins kept circulating for a while. People still had to trade, work land, move food, settle obligations, and get through the week. Because history may collapse, but people still needed to eat. So what you get is not a tidy replacement system. It's a patchwork. Old coins, metal by weight, goods, labour, food, livestock, favours and obligations. Whatever still works locally when the largest system no longer does. And Hoxne sits right in the middle of that process. And here's the really interesting part. Almost all of the silver coins had been clipped. 98% of them. Tiny slivers cut from the edges while the emperor's portrait was left intact, so the coin still looked official. The silver is being stretched. This is efficient in its way, not reassuring, but definitely efficient. And Hoxne isn't alone. Britain accounts for an extraordinary share of early 5th century precious metal hoards from across the empire. People were burying wealth and not coming back for it. So this is the first piece of the chain reaction. The money thins out. It gets clipped, stretched, buried and reused. And then the cash economy that helped hold Roman Britain together starts to fall silent. But once the money starts failing, you have to ask what happens to everything that depended on it. Pottery gives you one of the clearest views of how daily life in Britain was changing. Roman Britain had a large-scale pottery industry, kilns, specialist producers, transport links, regional markets, the sort of ordinary economic machinery that only looks boring until it stops working. By around 420, that system appears to have largely collapsed in much of Britain. Wheel-thrown and kiln-fired pottery becomes much harder to find at anything like the old scale. What replaced it was handmade pottery, cruder and local, and not especially interested in Roman standards. For a long time, that was taken as proof that Britain had simply fallen into a dark age, as though everyone collectively forgot how to make a decent pot the moment the legions left. But of course, that's too simple. As the historian Robin Fleming points out, post-Roman world wasn't built by people who had forgotten everything. It was built by people working with what they still had, what they still could make, and what still made sense in a smaller, rougher, more local economy. So pottery gives us the second piece of the chain reaction. What happens to the expensive parts of Roman life? And so we come back to that strange piece of the puzzle from the start, the Roman villa floor with the corn dryer cut right through it. As Oscar Wilde might have said, to lose one Roman villa is unfortunate. To lose an entire Roman way of life starts to look careless. At Butley Villa in Somerset, excavation evidence points to late industrial activity, including the removal of mosaic flooring and the establishment of a corn dryer and hearth. At Rock Villa in Brystone on the Isle of Wight, a corn dryer was dug into the floor of room 3. And at nearby Brading, interestingly also on the Isle of Wight, one was dug through an existing tessellated floor. And on one level it is comical. You have this carefully made mosaic, a floor designed to show taste, money, status, Roman comfort, the full look at me, I've arrived domestic experience. And then someone cuts into it and turns the room into part of a grain processing setup.
Sorry, what?
Which is definitely not what the mosaic artists would have had in mind. But as a clue, it's brilliant because it shows us something that a written source might never have bothered to record. It shows Roman Britain being reused from the inside. These buildings were designed around comfort and display, and a very Roman idea of what elite life should look like. And in Britain, that villa culture reached some of its most impressive forms in the 4th century. Wroxeter, for example, in Gloucestershire, had one of the largest and most spectacular mosaics in Roman Britain. It was huge and expensive, the kind of floor that doesn't say, "We're barely scraping by." Someone here had money and ambition and access to skilled craftsmen. So when we later find villa rooms being altered and subdivided or turned into practical areas for work, that's not just a change in an interior design, it's a change in the world those rooms belong to. But having said that, there were places where the old Roman ways were kept going. Wroxeter near Shrewsbury is one of the best examples of this. It was one of the largest towns in Roman Britain, and excavations led by Philip Barker with later work alongside Roger White suggested something remarkable. This wasn't just people lingering among ruins. It was organised activity, new buildings, and what looked like a genuine attempt to keep urban life going after imperial rule had ended. Buildings were still being laid out in an ordered way. Somebody, or some group of people, was still trying to hold on to the shape of a Roman town. But of course, there was a limit to what they could do. The later buildings were timber, not stone. The order was still there, the ambition was still there, but the material world underneath had changed. Now, not everyone accepts the strongest version of that argument. More recent work there has questioned how long this post-Roman phase lasted and how much of it was really urban life in the old Roman sense. But even with that caution, Wroxeter tells us that this wasn't a neat switch from Roman to non-Roman. And you can see that even more clearly in something harder to photograph than a mosaic: language. Latin didn't vanish from Britain completely. It survived in church use, learning inscriptions, and in Brittonic-speaking areas for longer. But as an everyday language of public life, especially in lowland Britain, it fades from view. Now, this is one of the reasons that Britain's break from Rome looks sharper than in places like Gaul, Spain, or Italy. So then the question becomes even bigger. If towns, villas, roads, money, and even language were changing, what was actually holding the old Roman world together? Guaranteed at some point you've driven down a terrible road full of potholes and wondered how the Romans managed to build roads that survived for thousands of years. Okay, not every Roman road survived looking fresh from the Imperial Roadworks Department, but the routes were astonishingly durable. Watling Street and the Fosse Way still shaped travel long after Roman authority in Britain had gone. But of course, use isn't the same as upkeep. After Rome left, people could still travel on Roman roads because they were too well built to vanish overnight. What they were no longer doing was rebuilding and maintaining them on anything like the old scale. Large-scale road improvement doesn't really return until the turnpike era beginning in the early 1700s. And that's true of Roman infrastructure more broadly. A hypercaust is a good example of this. It's ingenious and luxurious, expensive and fuel-hungry. Not the kind of thing that you keep running by accident. Bathhouses need water, fuel, labour and upkeep. Drainage systems need clearing. Water systems need maintenance. All of these things depend on money and specialists, on logistics and some larger authority capable of keeping the whole thing going. So Roman infrastructure only looks permanent while someone is paying for it. Some of this fraying had already begun before Rome left. So again, this isn't one clean historical moment where everything stops. It's just a rolling chain reaction. And if this video ended here, the answer would look simple. Roman Britain collapsed. But that would only be half the story. Because after all that loss, after the coins dry up and the villas change and the roads begin to fade, Britain doesn't simply become empty, ignorant, or dead. Something new appears. And if you want to see how extraordinary that new world could be, you go to Sutton Hoo. For a long time after Rome left Britain, this period was called the Dark Ages. And then you get to Sutton Hoo. In 1939, a landowner named Edith Pretty hired a self-taught excavator called Basil Brown to investigate a group of burial mounds on her estate in Suffolk. Brown had no university training, but he had decades of field experience. And when he began working on the largest mound, he found something that would change the way people understood post-Roman Britain. Beneath the soil was the impression of an entire ship. The timber had rotted away centuries ago, but the iron rivets were still in place, still holding the shape of the vessel in the earth. Inside, there was a burial chamber filled with the objects that had no business being in a supposedly dark age. A gold belt buckle weighing over 400 grams, decorated with interlacing animal patterns of extraordinary precision. Inlaid garnet shoulder clasps, each one made from individually cut stones and millefiori glass set into gold cells. A helmet with a face mask, now one of the most recognisable objects in British archaeology. Silverware from the Eastern Mediterranean. A set of spoons inscribed in Greek. Gold coins from France. Objects connected to trading worlds that reach as far as the Byzantine Empire, and through the garnets, possibly as far as Sri Lanka. The burial is widely believed to be that of King Radwald of East Anglia, who probably died around 624. That's roughly 2 centuries after Roman authority ended. And yet, here is a kingdom rich enough, skilled enough, and connected enough to bury its king with objects that rival anything Rome left behind in Britain. So now we can answer the question from the beginning of the video. Did Roman Britain collapse? As a Roman system, yes. The money, the state, the industries, the towns, the infrastructure, the elite villa culture all depended on a wider imperial machine. Once that machine stopped working in Britain, much of Roman life became impossible to sustain. And 2 centuries on, Sutton Hoo shows us a Britain that was no longer Roman, but it certainly wasn't empty or dark. And if you look at that belt buckle for any period of time, it was quite clearly brilliant. So what do you think? When Rome left Britain, did Roman Britain vanish, survive in pieces, or become something else entirely? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this kind of history, please make sure you're subscribed and give the video a like. I'll see you next time.